Darkness and despair were all he felt as he stumbled into the field toward the lone tree rising to the sky. It wasn't always like this. Is it better now?
Yeah.
It wasn't always like this. In fact, 3 years ago, Judas had been filled with excitement and anticipation as he followed Jesus of Nazareth into the hills around Galilee. Day by day, he noticed the groups of followers around Jesus grew. There were whispers of revolution on the wind. This Jesus, a simple carpenter who spoke like no other, teaching with the authority of the prophets. He healed diseases with a touch and cast out demons with a word. Could this really be the Messiah, the Christ? Staying with Jesus would be a smart move. If he really was the Messiah, then he had come to free Israel from oppression. Following a decisive victory over the Romans, God's national people would be reestablished as a light to the world. Yes, it was in his best interest to be close to Jesus of Nazareth, to gain his trust and support. Jesus was to be Judas's ticket to prestige and power. Then one day, as Judas listened to Jesus teach, an unshakable doubt began to root itself deep in his mind. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This wasn't the talk of a revolutionary. This was something else. Jesus couldn't be the Messiah. With the passing of time, the excitement for those following Jesus grew. And as their excitement grew, so did the resentment welling up within Judas. It was 6 days before the Passover, and Jesus had brought his little band to Bethany to visit his friend Lazarus. While there, Mary anointed Jesus with a vial of expensive perfume. Judas had seen enough. "What are you doing, woman? Don't waste that. It can be sold for more money than some people make in a year." Then, feeling everyone's eyes on him, he added sheepishly, "Well, think of all the poor people that money could have helped." Jesus stopped him and responded in Mary's defense, commending her for her beautiful action. This rebuke made Judas's blood boil. Once Jesus had finished speaking, Judas snuck quickly and quietly away from the party. His destination was set. He was sure. He made his way quickly to the chief priests. Jesus wasn't the Christ. He couldn't be. So many duped into following this fraud. Judas entered the room where they were lounging and asked, "What would you give me for Jesus?" "What?" the priest asked, surprise filling the room. "What did you say? Jesus?" Judas replied, "How much is he worth to you?" 30 pieces of silver were counted out and changed hands. As Judas was leaving, one man whispered to another, "What a sucker. I would have paid 4 times that amount." It was a dark night as Judas led the group of soldiers across the Kidron Valley and onto the olive grove on the other side, their steps guided by torchlight. He knew Jesus would be here, away from the crowds, alone with his disciples, the perfect place for an arrest. Judas spotted the silhouette group and walked up to them, torch held high, with a smile on his face. Judas peered into the orange glow lit faces of his longtime friends, looking for, no, not John, not James, no, not Peter, greeting them all with familiar nods. Finally, he spotted the man they came for. He approached him. A grin broke across his face. "Rabbi," Judas acclaimed as he moved and kissed him on the cheek. What was usually a sign of devotion, affection, and respect was here an act of betrayal, for it was the sign to the armed guard indicating the man they came for, Jesus of Nazareth. As the soldiers moved past Judas, they bumped him out of the way. Judas looked around at the anguished face of his friends, the family he'd known for the past 3 years, and his stomach immediately wrenched into knots. He glanced over at his soldier as one of the soldiers knocked Jesus to his knees. "What have I done?" Judas muttered under his breath. Judas watched with glazed eyes as Peter drew his sword to defend his rabbi, cutting off the ear of one of the captors. Jesus stopped Peter with a raise of his hand. Struggling to his feet, he reached out and touched the man's ear, making it whole. Judas turned and ran. As he left the garden, heading back down into the valley, he heard Jesus' voice. "Peter, put away your sword. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Early in the morning, Judas went back to the chief priests. When he arrived, he caught a glimpse of Jesus being led, bound down the street. Realizing that Jesus was condemned already, Judas was filled with a deep remorse. He barged into where the chief priests were laughing and carried on. He threw the silver coins to their feet. "Let him go. I've changed my mind," Judas said. "He's innocent. I have betrayed an innocent man." "What is this to us?" they replied. "That's your problem." With their words ringing in his ears, Judas found himself engulfed by darkness and despair, and he stumbled into the field towards the lone tree rising into the sky. With tears in his eyes, he slipped the circle over his head and around his neck, tightening the knot. "I'm sorry, Rabbi," Judas said, eyes clenched shut, tears streaming down his face. He stepped forward, the rope tightening, and he breathed his last breath.
Standing far off, he watched the scene unfold. Seeing red, failure and shame was all that he could feel. There, up the hill, his friend and teacher was hanging on the cross, waiting for death. He could see a scattering of his closest friends, gathered in groups, huddling in the shadow of the cross, but he couldn't bring himself to join them, not after what he had done. While passionate about God and learning Torah, Simon just didn't stand as a student. When he was around 10 years of age, he watched as the best of his peers went on to continuing studying Torah. He went home to learn the family trade, fishing. Went up early every morning, out on the water, casting nets, trying to catch enough fish to sustain the family. He was still a student, but rather than the scriptures, his lessons consists of learning about the wind in the water currents. He came to understand the depths and the contours of the Sea of Galilee, and even had favorite places to fish. Every afternoon he would come home from the water, continuing to work by mending nets to prepare for the evening fishing session. It was a lot of work, but it was honest work. Andrew was Peter's brother. Most days, to Simon's annoyance, Andrew would sneak off after the morning fishing was done in order to find and listen to a wide-eyed prophet outside the city that people called John the Baptizer. Leaving the afternoon work to Simon, one afternoon, while Simon was muttering to himself about how it was unfair that Andrew was getting out of the work, he heard his name called on the sea breeze, Simon. It was his brother Andrew. He came running up and skidded to a stop, breathless. "We have found the Messiah," he proclaimed excitedly with a twinkle in his eye. "Come on," he said, grabbing Simon by the hand and dragging him away from the nets and up through the town streets, dodging people walking by. They came to a small group sitting around listening to one talk. Andrew pulled Simon through the group and right up to the teacher. Jesus looked at Simon and said, "You are Simon, son of John." "Wait, he knows my name," Simon thought. "You'll be called Cephas," which when translated means Peter. A couple days later, during their morning fishing, they saw Jesus walking towards them along the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He stopped along the shore near them and called out to the two brothers, "Come, follow me. I will send you out to fish for people." Come, follow me. It couldn't be. Was the teacher actually inviting them to come and study under him? Did he actually see potential in them to take on his understanding of the scriptures and way of being in the world? Them, Andrew and Simon Peter, it was an offer too good to refuse. They pointed their boats to shore, dropped their nets, and followed him. Peter looked down at his hands, no longer calloused in the same way now 3 years later. It had been a while since he had picked up a fishing net. Now everyone called him Peter. The rabbi's name for him had stuck. His rabbi looked back to Jesus hanging on the cross and wept. As a disciple of Jesus, Peter had followed him everywhere he went. For 3 years, Peter had been watching Jesus closely, seeing how he talked to people, watching how he interacted with everyone. Peter listened intently to every word, trying to understand Jesus' understanding of God and his way of life in the world. He watched and listened carefully because disciples didn't just want to learn from their rabbi, they wanted to become like him. In calling them to follow him, Jesus was telling them they had what it takes to be like him. It was an incredible honor, and Peter tried hard to live up to it. He thought of that night out on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples had sent away while it was still dark, and they were crossing the lake to where Jesus was going to meet them on the other side. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come onto the water with you." "Come," he said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" Peter looked down at his sandaled feet that had walked on water for several steps out on the Sea of Galilee towards Jesus. "Why did you doubt?" he asked himself. Looking up at Jesus now, Peter realized how confused he was. He was so sure that Jesus was the Messiah. Everything he experienced during the 3 years of following Jesus, the compelling teachings, the miracles he performed, the transfiguration moment on the mountain, and yes, walking on water, all wove together a strong narrative that had Peter convinced, and he had declared as much, exclaiming to Jesus when asked, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." But now there wasn't much he was sure of. He thought of the events of the last couple of days, the meal in the upper room, and everything Jesus had shared with them, the time in the garden, and when he just couldn't stay awake, and then trying to prevent Jesus's arrest and thinking it was time to fight. He stopped. His mind went to his greatest failure and shame, the courtyard of the priest. Peter remained far off, watching the scene unfold. He was still heavy with failure and shame, but he was also tired, so tired. There, up the hill, his friend and rabbi was hanging.
Seeing the body of her son nailed to the cross was almost too difficult to bear. Her entire being was numb from the agony of the last few days. Her body slumped in defeat. Every tear had been shed. A mother's love grasping for what she wasn't sure. This nightmare moment was an end she had not dreamed of. She could remember like it was yesterday, the blinding light, the voice that spoke and didn't speak at the same time, words that seemed loud and whispered at the same time, the arrival that cut through and disrupted the normalcy of her day. No, it disrupted the normalcy of her life. "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." These words served as the introduction to the most magnificent calling imaginable, to carry, give birth to, and raise the child of promise. The angel's words had connected this moment to God's long-standing promises about the long-awaited Messiah. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. Seeing Jesus' struggling body certainly seemed like an end. But the birth, that special birth, all that swirled together at the time reinforced the angel's prophetic words. From a virgin birth to a celestial star shining bright right through to the visitations, shepherds, and then a bit later those astrologers arriving from the east. Jesus was special. He is special. Those early moments were packed to overflowing with so much hope. The angel's promises reverberating through her head and her heart, paired with the strange birth of his cousin, all involved were sure God was up to something. Even now, Mary could still recite the song she wrote about him. My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors. She didn't feel very blessed right now. There was so much certainty and hope about Jesus' life and what he would accomplish. Even that episode in the temple when he was 12 seemed to confirm he would do big things with his life. Looking up at him now, Mary couldn't help but feel a little foolish. The rich and powerful win, period. Why didn't she believe it could be different? Why did she believe it could be different? Why did she believe her son could change things? Even now, Jesus hanging between two thieves, an innocent man between two criminals. It was a brutal reminder of how the powerful get their own way. Jesus, Mary thought, I have loved being your mother. Throughout your life, you showed care for me and your siblings, especially once Joseph died. You really stepped up as the man of the house. There was a pause as she remembered something. But there was that one time we came to see you. You were teaching and didn't have time to see us. Through the window, we heard them explain, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And his response startled her. Who are my mother and my brothers? After a pause, they heard him say, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Mary cried all the way home. James had given her a hug and said that Jesus hadn't meant it like it sounded. Jesus, you will be missed. Your family feels lost without you. Seeing the body of her son nailed to that harsh tree was almost too difficult to bear. Her entire being was numb from the agony of the last few days. Her body slumped in defeat. Every tear had been shed, a mother's love grasping. For what? She wasn't sure. The nightmare moment was an end she had not dreamed of. A hoarse and pained voice interrupted her thinking. It was Jesus, struggling to talk. Barely louder than a whisper, it required straining to hear. What was he saying? Woman, here is your son. Looking up, Mary saw Jesus' disciple John standing beside her. And to John he said, here is your mother. And she fell into his arms, even in death. Jesus showed loving care for his mother.